it really gives me a bleak pleasure to open this workshop, which is one of now regular annual events. We are trying to define our own benchmarks, not just civil society, but through that to push our institutions and the whole society towards change for ourselves. But naturally, the point of this workshop is to seek support on the part of the EU institutions in the EU integration process of our country to actually help us achieve that.
In the negotiations with Croatia. And as we know, those negotiations in their final stages focused very much on the issues in Chapter 24, the negotiations, dealing exactly with these questions related to governance, rule of law, and so on. The governments themselves, to some extent, are an important interlocutor for the European Union in addressing these kinds of issues. But delivery on these issues cannot depend, obviously, on governments alone. We saw in the countries in Central Europe, which joined the EU in 2004, that there was to some extent an uncompleted transformation. And that's because there really wasn't the complete follow-through at the level of civil society to the progress that was being made in the accession negotiations. And it was sometimes said, even in countries far to the west with a long bourgeois tradition, such as the Czech Republic, that the EU had to some extent become a substitute for civil society. This is something that we don't really want to see in the Western Balkans, Turkey, and elsewhere.
It is a great pleasure to speak on behalf of the Balkan Civil Society Development Network. It is a real pleasure because this is a network that has grown into a confident partner that has credibility at a national level, but also a credible interlocutor to the European Commission as well. To have brought the network to the position to be able to present today this initiative, which might be perceived quite provocative eventually, or overambitious for some, that we call civil society acquis. And that is at least bringing together all the preconditions for strong and vibrant civil societies in our countries. It has the merit of having been developed by the member organizations and the external expertise, of course, but it is also very much criteria that we set ourselves. I think for the first time we're not getting preset criteria, but we thought that we could set something that could be an optimal standard to be achieved, and we will be striving for. A lot has been achieved. We were discussing this previously. I think that we should all admit that a remarkable transformation has taken place in the past decade in the region. However, we have not reached the point where all these achievements are irreversible, and I think that we have to really keep our efforts very, very strong to just cross some more levels of progress.
When we talk to the policymakers, decision makers, some of you are sitting here, when we talk to civil society activists, the experts that are involved in the project, everybody is basically demanding concrete, tangible policy measures that they could take in order to meet a rather overall intangible political criteria of a democratic society. And when we look at, and that's how I think this whole idea of the acquis sort of trickled up rather than down at this point, which was about trying to convert a criteria that has been political and has been assessed without those kind of standards and concrete indicators that were typical of other areas of the acquis into, tangible legislation, policy measures, institutions that can be adopted at the country level. There is a great risk to that. There's a great challenge to that, of course. And when I talk to some of the old member states representatives, they say that cannot really be done because there's no single model for civil society development or for government CSO cooperation in the old EU, so to speak. Where do we go for? And what we are saying is basically from our experience over the past decade is that that is true. There's no such model if you look at it, but there are principles and there are standards that can be defined as good practice. In some cases, also part of international law or EU law defined in the treaty. In other cases, more as a matter of good practice and enabling practice. That can be spelled out, and that could be looked at, if you like, as an acquis, and that's the provocative part of it, of course.
So far, because our network has now, for the fourth year in a row, analyzed the progress report for the civil society development benchmark, if we can call it, what the Commission is looking at, it's the freedom association, so it's basic thing, freedom association, the consultation processes, access to public information. But last year, in the last progress report, we also noted a bit of open door that the Commission is trying to go also to look a bit of something that's very important to us as civil society, and we're also trying to highlight that in the matrix, which is access to state funding by civil society, or specifically transparency and accountability of state funding for civil society. And also a bit about fiscal regime, but not that much. And remember, and I will highlight that several times, these are the two maybe most important issues for the sustainable or irreversible development of civil society as a sector. So the matrix as methodology. It is primarily monitoring mechanism, but with the intention to advocate. It is developed and is to be applied by civil society from enlargement countries. The idea, as I said, it is to try to provide continuous pressure and support and direction, so guidance to government in this area. So it is primarily focused on pressuring governments. But we do see, and this is why we're presenting it today, that in this pressuring on local level, we really need also the support of the European Commission, especially since it itself defined benchmarks in these areas for our country. What is enabling environment? And we defined 7 areas, and some of the areas have sub-areas. So what is actually the enabling environment, first of all? What are the areas that the matrix cover? Naturally, it's basic and fiscal legislation. Basic legislation in terms of, as we will see, freedom of association, the fundamental rights. And also fiscal regime, something that the Commission is not really benchmarking, but for us as civil society, this is crucial. How we are treated by our institution in terms of tax. The second area is government policy and institutional framework. Again, maybe something that you would expect, but maybe also a controversial area, because again, there is no one model. You can always discuss whether there needs to be a government policy in place for civil society development in the first place, and whether you really need institutional framework. But based on our experience, the culture in our region, the legislative experience, or the continental law, I'm not a lawyer, but still, the practice that we have and the experiences we as in our network is that this is really important at the stage that our democracies, our country says that we need some kind of policies in place and some kind of institutional framework in place. The third area defined is what we call usually with one word consultation. But it's a bit different. It's the civil society organizations' participation in decision making. The fourth area, also very important, but also very little addressed by the European Commission. So very important in terms of civil society is funding, especially public funding for civil society. So CSO involvement in provision of public services is the fifth area that we have defined in the matrix. The sixth area, also very important for the sector, very much neglected in, the Commission does not actually address this area at all, but also in terms of national policies and exist in any kind of standards in this area, is human resources in the sector. And the last, which is an area that actually incorporates all of the previous area, is the trust or the overall spirit of cooperation. In our countries, civil society is still a question of political will. In the European context of EU integration, in a lot of cases you will see civil society being treated part of a problem of administrative capacity or public administration reform. Civil society development is about values, it's about norm, it's about political will.
Yesterday I had a discussion on ticking the boxes, and I'm somehow going to warn of possible ticking the boxes, because just looking into the metrics, and I've been in this business, believe me, for quite some time within the state, and now in the NGO sector, I see that it might be easy to tick the boxes. Yes, this has been done in many of our countries, but in reality that we do not have that situation, that this is not really implemented and done. So I would warn of how we measure indicators. So how do we say that this is implemented?
That's why we're setting the optimum standard, so it's not just ticking the box, but we use that, this is where we are, where do we need to put in the advocacy? Then in the next half of the year, at the end, how are we advancing, or which should we strengthen advocacy in that area? So it's monitoring, looking back, but it's setting the course of our advocacy towards the institutions.
The whole conference today discussed the possibility of introducing the EU acquis for civil society development. Do you think, is it possible? Is it needed?
I think it is possible and it is needed, although I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. But nevertheless, I think that this effort and this project is really a good step and first step forward to establish sort of unified standards for civil society development. It will be much easier to monitor development and also to compare the civil society development between different states.
One of political criteria is strengthening civil society. Is it well implemented?
It is partly. I mean, looking at the Western Balkans, I think in terms of the fundamentals, the political criteria, a lot of that has been fulfilled. If we compare with the rest of the world, it looks quite good. But I think there are other aspects of building a democratic culture and dialogue and involvement of civil society that yet has to be developed.
And do you think that today's discussion on possible EU acquis on status of civil society would help in such a matter? Would it be possible at all?
I think it's important to highlight in concrete terms what is required. Then again, coming back to the issue of acquis, there is not much of acquis in terms of the body of legislation at the EU level on civil society, and that needs to be recognized. But that doesn't mean that it's not important.
The matrix that was presented, do you see it as a useful tool for your work too, for the work of civil society facility and help that it provides to civil society across the enlargement area?
Absolutely. One of the key goals of the civil society facility is the enabling environment to support actors in the aspiring countries to improve the environment for civil society. And this matrix puts out some very clear benchmarks and indicators that we can use both in terms of a dialogue with actors, but we can also use it in terms of the way we design our support and the way we follow up and monitoring results.
Let me just be clear when it comes to the question of civil society acquis. There is no acquis as such on civil society, just as there is no specific acquis on many of the issues that we are looking at in the context of the political criteria. So we would feel it's better not to talk about civil society acquis as such, but certainly the whole issue of the enabling environment is very, very important, and I think also potentially very helpful for those practitioners on the ground who are trying to help and support the countries to move forward in the accession process and to create the right environment for the reforms to actually work in practice. And I certainly feel that the work that you are doing is something that could be very helpful in this regard to help us to understand from your point of view where things stand in the countries and what they could best do to create this enabling environment for NGOs to flourish and ultimately for the country to meet the requirements of membership further down the line.
It could be very expensive for the government, or at least the Serbian one, but it reflects on the region as such. It could bring us a lot of costs in terms of reporting or following the system or asking the system to look like as it is defined here. It could be a much bigger administrative burden for the both local and the national, I mean in the idealistic scenario, of course, both for the local and national administration, not to mention another bodies, another strategic framework that is need to be established in order to fulfill this criteria. I would go for it to map the system as it looks now and to try to adjust it the best as we could, relying on the existing models, both legislative, institutional, and strategic. I would go to the offices or to the institutional or to the relevant counterparts where is needed or where there is a possibility to potentially integrate these optimal standards. I would see this office as the one, especially knowing that we're about to start working on the national strategic framework from September, October. So I would use this opportunity to introduce basically some of the standards or benchmarks presented here. And then I would finish, as I said, and it was said previously, I wouldn't see it as a demand or the requirements. It wouldn't be for the first time. We are already used to respond. I would see it as a tool for the further improvement, both for the system that should regulate the sustainable framework for itself and for the civil society development.
On the conference, the matrix for monitoring enabling environment for civil society development was presented. Do you find it as a useful tool? Would it be useful also to your work from the position of the governmental office for NGOs in Serbia?
I just need to say at the beginning that the Office for Cooperation with Civil Society of the Government of Serbia was recognized and was as one of the partners in the process of the creation of this matrix, and together with the Croatian office, we were the only governmental representatives that took part in the creation of this matrix for further development or monitoring of the development of the sustainable environment for civil society development. I find it very useful. And I think that it could be used in many cases, in many senses. From the government sides, I would say it's necessary and needed for the process of self-assessment. In terms of further investment in the civil society sustainability, then in the progress that has been made or it will be made, and then in the context of reporting to the European Union as the overall progress in fulfilling the political criteria and democratization of the society in whole.
This idea of a civil society are key. And I personally, at this stage, I think you understand that I cannot speak for the Parliament in general. I can speak for myself right now. I think this is a very good and important idea because we have to come to creating standards for participation, standards for the proper work of civil society organizations, for their abilities to work, the possibilities they have, and so on. And these standards should certainly not just come from above, should be developed by civil society organizations themselves. I would very much appreciate if this would be part of the accession process and would be estimated as one of our important criteria on accession countries.
What I think in conclusion I can say is definitely that the idea is, as somebody said it, avant-garde. It's maybe not ahead of our time, but it is really striving to something that is not just basic, because it's probably basic is what we have already in place in the region, but we're striving for something more. We're trying for quality. We're trying to promote civil society as a value in our society at a time that is very challenging globally, on the European level, but also for our countries. And that this idea of a civil society acquis does make sense in the sense of having a consolidated, consensus-based approach to what it means civil society development, what does that mean in terms of value, but also how is this concretized in our society and on what difference it makes in terms of effect and daily life of the citizens in our country.